Okay, hello. It is lovely to be back in front of audiences again. I've done quite a lot of proclaiming at my screen over the last 2 years. It's nice to actually see your faces, and it's really great to be here. So yeah, that was a great intro. I don't need to say a lot about what I do. Fairly recently, I became a Googler, so I'm content lead for web.dev and developers.chrome.com. And I'm also a member of the CSS Working Group, now representing Google there. I was an invited expert for quite some time. And really, I think, what I want to say to start with is that CSS is absolutely amazing right now. There is so much really cool stuff going on. Stuff landing in browsers, the things that's been worked on, really game-changing. It's like, we're over and over again seeing new stuff landing in browsers that actually completely changes, and there's potential to completely change what we're doing. And a lot of this is stuff that we were told for a long time couldn't be done. There's a whole bunch of stuff landing in browsers at the moment that even people in the CSS Working Group thought we wouldn't be able to do. And a lot of that's down to sort of behind-the-scenes work in browsers. So this talk is a roundup of some of the stuff that I think is really neat. A lot of this actually has got decent browser support already, and a lot of the other stuff can be used as a progressive enhancement, which will sort of let you know what's coming as well. So let's get started. I say there's a lot going on in browsers. I've started writing a monthly post on web.dev of what's new in the web platform. Now I remember a time when there was a period of 5 years between releases of Internet Explorer. The web basically stopped for 5 years while we waited for a new browser to come out. And now every month, new stuff is landing in browsers, enough that I can write a monthly post and say, hey, look, this is what's cool. So I think that's that's something to keep an eye on. If you go and have a look at that each month, you'll see some of the things, the selected things, because there's so much landing, I kind of pick out my favorites. So let's have a look at some of these things. Form input elements, they're a bit of a nuisance really, and have been for a long time. You can't really style them very well. One little thing that's arrived recently is the accent color property, which lets you include your brand color in HTML input elements. It's not complete control, but it might give you something. And in one line of CSS, you sort of can just improve the look of those things, make them match your brand a bit with accent color. So it's kind of a useful little thing. It's one of those nice things, and it just looks like this. So we say accent color, and then whatever the color you want to use, and obviously you can use custom properties as well. This is in all of the browsers now. And if it's not supported, like all of CSS, if it's not supported, well, the browser will just ignore it and will display the thing as normal. So it's a very nice progressive enhancement because you get that little touch if it's there. And there's massive stuff happening in CSS color. For a very long time, we've been tied basically to RGB. In fact, I remember yesterday I was speaking and I put up a chart of the web-safe colors when we used to be tied to 216 colors on the web. It's not quite that bad these days. We do have RGB, but there's lots of new color spaces opening up, such as lab color, which sort of gives us much wider range and much richer color on the web, which is pretty exciting. And along with that, we've got some new color functions which will enable dynamic colors in CSS. Now, I really like these things. This is color mix, which lets you mix two colors. So the percentage is how much of the first color you want to mix with the second. So here I'm just mixing increasing amounts of white into color using the LCH color space. This also accepts the color spaces. This is really great. If you're doing any kind of theming and so on, being able to just do this stuff dynamically. We've been doing things like this in preprocessors for a long time. But of course, that means you've got to compile the stuff out. It's going to be a fixed thing when it gets onto the web. With these kind of functions, you're able to do that dynamically. I think there's an awful lot of interesting stuff that is possible because of that. You can try out color mix. At the moment, this isn't in any shipping browser, but it's in Safari Technology Preview. You have to enable a flag there in the browser in the develop menu, and it's also in Firefox behind a flag. So this is something that's coming soon. I think this is really something to play with. I think it's going to be very useful, as I say, for things that want to do dynamic theming. But also, I bet there's loads of really cool creative stuff that people can be doing with this. The other function which is really useful is colour contrast. Again, if you're allowing people, say, to set a background colour, then you have this problem where you're kind of having to guess which colour to use as text on top of that to still enable contrast. Colour contrast lets you check and see, which colour has the most contrast from a list of colours against a single colour that you've passed in. So here I'm passing in a background colour and I'm seeing whether white or black is the most contrasty. Again, really, really handy if you're doing any kind of dynamic theming. And you can try this out. This is also in Safari Technology Preview at the moment. So you can try that out, and hopefully we're going to get that in other browsers soon. So these are sort of very little functions, but really adding quite a lot of power to CSS as a language. So this is something that is usable right now. One of the problems with using web fonts is that you kind of get that layout shift. You want to use a fallback font so that people see something. You don't have to wait for the font to load before you see the text. But then if the fallback font is a bit different in size to the font that's incoming, you get that kind of layout shift thing going on as it loads in. So what you can do with these new descriptors is essentially adjust the font so that it matches better the incoming web font. And in fact, you can tweak both fonts. You can tweak the incoming font as well if you want to. So here's a code sample. We're loading the local Arial font and using size adjust 90% because that's going to match the incoming web font better. And then in the font family declaration, we use both. So there's other descriptors we can use. Ascent override changes the ascent metric, descent override the descent metric, and line gap override to change the line gap metric. You can use these everywhere other than Safari at the moment. Again, it's a good progressive enhancement. If a browser doesn't support these, it's just going to load the font as normal, and yes, you're going to get that little layout shift that you had to start with. But if the browser does support it, then you're going to improve the loading experience for people. You're going to have less of that kind of jiggling around thing going on. Now, this talk is kind of one that I update all the time. It's kind of like I've got a set of slides and demos, and then someone says, oh, can you talk about what's new in CSS? And I think the entire talk has been completely changed several times since I started doing it, because new things happen and other things kind of become old hat. It's been around for 6 months now. No one wants to hear about that. When I did this talk a few months ago, I was able to talk about cascade layers and say, oh, this is something really cool that's going to come soon. I'm doing this talk today, and it's available in all browsers. So cascade layers let you control specificity in layers or groups of selectors, which means that we're getting away from this problem where you have to carefully order all your selectors to make sure that the last one wins, essentially, if they all match. This is really important when you're working with other people's CSS. That might be CSS from a framework, or even just you've got a giant team of people all writing CSS, and someone makes a change to the internal sort of base styles you use, and it kind of blows up all the specificity, and nobody understands why things have gone funny looking. Cascade layers is really going to change that. So here's a very, very small example. I'm defining here 2 layers. Now, the order of the layers matters. So the first thing I do is I name my layers up the top there, and I put them in the order that I want them to be. Because I want the special layer to take preference there over base. And so that's the order that the specificity is going to be worked out in. And it doesn't matter then what order the stuff comes afterwards. Where I've declared those things is the most important. And inside the layer, the normal rules of the cascade apply. I think this is an absolute game changer for CSS, and particularly for CSS with large teams, and using other people's CSS. It's going to make such a big difference with something that we really have been battling with for a very long time. And it landed in all browsers pretty much at the same time. I think because of this importance of this, if you're going to have something that messes around with specificity and the cascade, it's got to be everywhere, otherwise we can't use it. And so, all the browsers landed this. And so, you're going to be able to start to use it. And I think that it's just going to be incredibly useful. And I think a few years down the line, it's going to be one of those things, a bit like having, the web-safe colors, that we're going to look back and think, oh, remember when we had to battle with everything overwriting each other? You know, and it's one of those things that is really going to change web development ultimately once, you know, we feel it's sort of within our sort of browser support matrix and we can use it. And then aspect ratios. So the web kind of got really squishy with responsive design. And so we were sort of making our widths nice and squishy. But quite often we then need to be able to define the aspect ratio. And where this comes up and has come up sort of forever is when you deal with video content. Video content that's being embedded via an iframe. It's fine if you stick a video with a video element onto the page, or you put an image onto the page, because the browser understands that's got an aspect ratio and it doesn't squash it. It's fine. That's, you know, we don't squish things in CSS and distort them. But if you use an iframe, that hasn't got an aspect ratio. And so we had this thing where you want the width to be squishy of your video, but then what do you do about the height? What we did about the height for a very long time is what we call the padding hack, where we use another kind of quirk of CSS to sort of fake an aspect ratio. Works most of the time, sometimes does slightly odd things. And it's because the value of padding used in the block dimension is copied from the inline dimension, so you can use that to work out an aspect ratio. We've now got a property, an aspect ratio property, that lets you explicitly define the aspect ratio of a box. And you can just say, I would like something with an aspect ratio of 16:9. And so that means, you know, if you've got a dimension on one side, you set an explicit dimension, or you're just letting that be the size of the container, the aspect ratio will always be correct. So here I've got a couple of grid tracks, and these demos are all online if you want to look at them. A couple of grid tracks. I've dropped boxes that are set to have an aspect ratio. Their width is defined by the track they're in, which might be squishy, and their height is by the ratio. And that looks a bit like this. So, you know, it's very, very straightforward. Lets you sort of define that. And it can definitely be used for other things. I think especially when you look at all the nice flexible, squishy sizing that we get in grid. So this little demo is a figure element. I've got 3 images and a fig caption. I've given the images a 1:1 aspect ratio, so they'll be square no matter how wide they are. And then I'm using grid to overlay the fig caption across the 3. And that's using dev tools. You can see sort of where the grid is and how the caption is then laid across. The other thing that they're useful for aspect ratios can be used to avoid layout shift. If you know how big parts of your layout are going to be up front, you can define them with an aspect ratio. And prior to this landing as a CSS property, browsers started to use it internally to map the width and height on images and other things with an aspect ratio to prevent layout shift as the images load in. One of the things that happened when we moved to responsive design is that we realized that we didn't really care about the actual size of the images on our pages. So we stopped adding the width and height attributes to the HTML element. And so what happens is, you know, you've got a page with a lot of images, particularly like on a phone or something. The text loads in, and then the images slowly load in. And because the browser doesn't know how big they are, it doesn't reserve any space, and then all the text jiggles around. If you add the width and height attributes back onto your images, browsers would use that to calculate an aspect ratio, and it will reserve space, and you don't get that jiggliness. So, you know, if you're not adding width and height attributes on your images, please start, because browsers will use that as an optimization, and, you know, layout will be better, you know, as things load in. And, you know, you can use aspect ratio now in all of the browsers. So it's something that you can start using and start playing around with as a creative thing, as well as being handy for your video iframes. And then we have subgrid. This is like a favorite feature of mine. I've been talking about grid layout for a very, very long time. I was talking about grid layout for about 5 years before grid layout landed in browsers, like the sort of CSS vaporware lady. I was kind of very glad that it did land after all that time. But when we sort of had the grid spec was going into browsers, one thing that actually got removed from the level 1 spec was this concept of subgrids, of having the ability for not just the children of the grid to sit on the grid, but also things nested further down in the structure. It was removed from the spec because it turned out to be quite complicated, and we actually did want to ship grid at some point. And so, so it allowed us for the rest of the spec to enter in browsers, which obviously was very good. So subgrid kind of got pushed back, and what we have is this. It's actually very, very simple. It's a new value of grid template columns and grid template rows. So if you've got a child item, instead of defining its tracks, what you say is, I would just like that to be a subgrid, and then it gets the number of tracks, of the area it's sat on. So in this case, I've got an item here which is spanning from grid column 1 to 3, so that gives it 2 tracks, basically, 2 column tracks. It becomes a grid, and then it gets grid template column subgrid, so it gets 2 tracks, basically, and they're tied to the tracks of the parent, which means that if you've got a bunch of things, they're all going to line up with each other. So it's, pretty simple in use, and kind of behaves like you would expect. So here's a different take on my images and aspect ratio. This time I've got a caption for each image. Now, subgrid here is letting those captions, which are nested down, inside the figure, it's letting them line up with each other. So although one of them has got 2 lines of text and the other have only got 1, it's sort of basically letting them sit in the same row, which lets them line up nicely. And it's this sort of stuff that subgrid's really good for, lining up bits of a user interface for you. So support's not looking so great at the moment. Now, in some cases, such as that lining up of the captions, that works as an enhancement very nicely. If the browser doesn't support subgrid, your captions aren't going to be as neatly aligned, but they'll be perfectly workable. They'll be exactly as they would be at the moment without subgrid. So there are some use cases where you can say, yes, subgrid could be an enhancement, but I think there's quite a lot of things with layout where you kind of don't want to tie your layout to something that isn't everywhere. But there's good news on that front, because subgrid is part of the project called Interop 2022. This is the Interop 2022 dashboard as it stands a couple of days ago when I took this screenshot. This is experimental browsers, so Chrome Dev and Firefox Nightly and Safari Technology Preview. Now, these scores are based on web platform tests for the sort of features that are included in this project. So what we've got is sort of 15 different features. One of them is subgrid. Another one is those color functions that I showed you earlier. Some of them are things that are already in browsers but have got some tricky bugs that need to be sorted out. Things like scroll snap, that's one of the features. So we've got this set of 15 features. And all of the browsers got together earlier in the year and worked out which features should be included. There was a sort of fairly robust discussion process working out which of the features, because obviously it was important that the features could be fixed by the browsers. So we've taken these features. All of these features have got web platform tests that test whether or not they work properly in the browser. And we can run those tests. Those tests have been run constantly on the different browsers. And from that, we're getting this score. And so it's almost like a little competition between browsers who can make their engine the best by fixing the most stuff. And subgrid is one of those features. So at the moment, obviously it's already in Firefox. It is now in Safari Technology Preview, and they recently launched their beta of Safari 16. It's in there, so it's going to ship in the next version of Safari. It is being worked on in Chrome. The Edge team, the Microsoft Edge team, are working on that implementation in Chrome. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'll be able to pass all those tests, and we'll have subgrid available in browsers. And I'm really excited for that. I feel it's been a big missing feature of grid layout, the fact that you can only the direct children will lay out on your grid. And I think it's going to open up so many different possibilities there. I've talked a bit about layout shift in a couple of places with aspect ratio and also with font loading. And I think, sort of your layout not feeling stable is a real problem to users if things feel like they're jiggling around. And if we are talking about things like your single page web apps, maybe Stuart wasn't so keen on those all the time, but I think, when you're talking about that, when you're actually loading in things with JavaScript, you can cause an awful lot of kind of jiggling around and as things get relayed out. But with those single page apps, there's often a lot of stuff on the page that doesn't change at all. You've got a bunch of stuff that you load it that first time, it's never going to move. But the problem is that the browser doesn't know that. The browser doesn't know that you're not going to mess about with that at some point. And that's what the sort of concept of CSS containment with the contain property gives us. It gives us a way to tell the browser, hey, look, this thing is not going to change. Nothing from the outside is going to affect it. Nothing inside this box can affect the things on the outside. So we can add the contain property and give this hint to the browser that it's not going to have to worry about this thing. It's not going to have to lay it out again. And that allows browsers to do their own optimizations to avoid sort of doing expensive work that they don't need to do. So you really just say, sort of contain layout in this case, and that's saying the layout is not going to change of this box. So that's really worth checking out. It is now working in all browsers. And again, if a browser doesn't support it, well, kind of nothing's going to happen. It's going to be exactly the same as it was before. So you can definitely start to apply that as an optimization strategy. And I really like, we like to talk about all the kind of fancy features that let us make cool demo. But actually, I think for end users, a lot of the time, it's these features that just make the everyday experience of browsing the web better. Actually can have the biggest impact, that make pages feel faster and make things seem more stable. Actually, those things are really important to users, probably more so than us being able to do another fancy thing that we'd quite like to do creatively. But the thing about containment, this idea of containment, it also opened up another possibility. I've been talking about CSS for a very, very long time. I've been talking about layout for a very long time. I've been talking about adding to the web platform for a long time. And whenever I ask groups of developers what new thing they would want in CSS, they would tell me container queries or element queries. And I'd always say, well, no, I don't think that can be done. And I was talking to somebody else. I was talking to Tab Atkins from the CSS Working Group yesterday, about this. And he was like, yeah, he was one of those people, and he's, his name is on about half of the CSS specs. And he was like, yeah, we didn't think it could be done. And so, developers were asking for this. They were asking for something like media queries, but that applied to elements on the page, to individual boxes, because so many of us now work in kind of pattern libraries and so on. And we don't know where these things are going to end up, and we don't know how much space they're going to have. And so just querying the total width of the viewport isn't particularly helpful a lot of the time. And so container queries let you query the size of the container that the item's in. And so, this is really important. I think this is one of those things that is, again, going to be a complete game changer. Because, the little figure component I showed you before, it'll resize nicely in a responsive design, but it kind of ends up really tiny because all I can do is look at the size of the page itself. So container queries are coming. There's a bunch of work happening at the moment. There was work initiated by David Barron at the time. He was at Mozilla, and it's continued by Miriam Suzanne, who is doing epic things to get this spec driven forward. So I'm just here to explain things. It's not a spec that I'm particularly working on myself. Other people are doing that. So I'm going to have a go at just explaining a little bit about this spec. You're going to need to sort of enable a flag or use Safari Technology Preview to have a look at this. And the spec is changing quite rapidly. All of us who are talking about this, sort of open up our demos. We're about to go and do a talk or whatever, and discover they don't work anymore because there's been a spec change, and the browser, as Chrome, the work they're doing, they're like, oh yeah, let's implement that, and we open up Canary, it doesn't work anymore. So this is changing quite quickly, although it is starting to solidify now. So you need a container, and that's going to be whatever's the parent of your components, and we need to know what dimension we're querying. So we set this up with a container type property, and here we're saying, inline size. We want to query the inline size of that container. So if you apply this to your container, it's likely that not a lot will happen immediately. Now, this basically applies, it makes a containment context as if you'd use the contain property. And it applies layout style and inline size containment to the box. So what will happen is it will make the box become a new block formatting context, which means that floats will be contained and margins won't collapse through the box. And that's the same as using the contain property. So if you did happen to have floated elements in something that you wanted to make into a container, they would end up kind of wrapped by the container, they'd end up inside. So in a couple of places, if you're using floats or if you've got collapsing margins, you might see a visual difference when you make something a container, but in most cases you won't see that, because particularly if you're working with things from a pattern library, you tend not to have, floats that are poking out of stuff and things. So even if you don't see any kind of layout change, you've created a containment context and it's now available to be queried in your CSS. You can also add, if you want, a container name, which allows you to specify which container to query. If you don't add a name, then the container used will be the one that's nearest to the element doing the querying. And then once you've got a container, you can query it, and it's pretty much like using a media query. Use @container, the browser uses the nearest containment context. And if you want to actually query something with a name, you can use @container, sidebar, what have you, and that would query the container that you've named sidebar. So this is a very, very simple demo. I've got 3 fixed width grid columns and 1 taking the remaining space as 1FR. And the reason the last 2 are blue is that the third is a 300 pixel grid track and the fourth uses FR unit, and it resolves to greater than 220 pixels. So I'm basically saying, if something is min width 220 pixels, then we'll change the background color. So if we go back to that little figure component that I had, now I'm able to create 2 layouts for that component based on the available space in the container. So I can start by creating my sort of a narrow view if it's put into a small container. And then I can redefine it. So it really is just like doing your sort of mobile first responsive design, except that we're able to look at the size of the container rather than, what screen real estate you've got. And so that's really the basics of using container queries. There's lots more, and there's lots more stuff coming for that spec. Even sort of style containment, be able to query style, but that's not part of the initial implementation. So we're setting up things that you want to treat as containers and then query them in the same way as using media queries. Now, if you're one of those people who has asked CSS speakers for years why we don't have container or element queries, you might be wondering, why on earth did that take so long? I mean, that's a few lines of CSS. The answer really is in browser engines and their ability to do this stuff in a performant way. Because the thing with something that has a nice, simple syntax that solves a lot of problems is that people are going to use it, and they're going to use it all over the place, and they're going to adopt it really quickly. And so it has to perform really, really well. Otherwise, we give people something that lets them make the web worse, and we don't want to do that. We want to give you things that can make things better. So in terms of Chrome, the reason this has been enabled in Chrome in particular is that there's been this enormous effort called rendering ng to rewrite the rendering engine for Chrome. Now, this has fixed a huge number of bugs. I think it was like 72 table bugs were fixed by the tables ng part of this, which enabled things like position sticky in tables, which didn't work in Chrome because of problems. It's enabling things like fragmentation to work better, so that the break properties if you're using multicol. And there's masses and masses of stuff that has been fixed in Chrome by going back to the start and kind of rewriting the rendering engine. And so sometimes when things seem to be happening very slowly, that's the situation. It's the same situation as why subgrid isn't yet in Chrome, because it had to wait for grid ng, which was the rewrite of grid rendering as part of rendering ng, before then the work on subgrid could start on top of that. So, there's this sort of huge amount of work. If you are nerdy about browsers and this stuff, this series of posts, there's a whole series of these going into different parts of that work to rewrite the rendering engine. They are technical. I edited them. They've been written by browser engineers. But if you like to dive into that stuff, it's a real insight into the work that has to go in to get this stuff to work. So that's why it's taken a long time to have something like container queries, because we really didn't think we could do it because of the technology that we were working with. But browsers are getting better all of the time and enabling things, and that's why we get things that sometimes we thought wouldn't work. They say, Rendering NG has also fixed an awful lot of bugs that people run into, and part of the Interrupt 2022 project and its sort of predecessor, Compact 2021, has been looking at a lot of these kind of annoying bugs that people run into, and a lot of those were fixed by this project. So, I love shiny new CSS come into the browsers, but I think it's brilliant to see problems in the platform fixed to make it easier for us to work cross-browser. Because, those are the things that needle you every day. It's like we love all the new stuff, but actually when you're working on the web and developing things, it's all those little things that cause you a problem, that when they're fixed, it just makes developing better. And all browsers care about that. I have colleagues at all of the browsers, and it's something that comes up all of the time, is how do we make this better for developers? How do we make a better experience for their users? But then it starts to get really interesting when we look at all these features, and the features that are new and the features that are being fixed so that we can use them reliably, because everything that lands in the platform kind of becomes a multiplier. Because it's not just that you get that thing, you don't just get subgrid. You get subgrid plus everything else that we already have. And so, as people who are good and sort of creative at this stuff, I'm not, right? I just talk about how it works. I've never been particularly creative around this stuff. I'm quite good at explaining it. But then I look at what other people are doing. And every time we get one of these new things, you see, this sort of whole raft of exciting stuff as people start to bring together these different things that have landed. And because there's so much happening at the moment, there's just some fascinating stuff happening. And you look out like on CodePen, and there are demos, and I'm thinking, I'd never have thought to do something like that. It's really exciting. And so Safari 16 in their beta have got a bunch of these things together. They have, and they are the only browser to have at the moment, they have subgrid and container queries. So if you get the Safari 16 beta or Safari Technology Preview, you can play with both subgrid and container queries. I think this is going to be a really useful practical combination, because if you've got a component that has multiple grid tracks, you'll be able to choose whether to turn on subgrid if there's enough space to make use of them. And I think that's going to be really, really handy for these sort of patterns. This is an incredibly simple example because I just wanted to try out that it actually worked. So I'm using block layout until I know I've got enough space based on the side of the grid. And then I turn on grid and subgrid and use the tracks defined on the parent. So that means that items in the subgrid can then align with items outside of the component. So that's kind of something to look at. When you see this new stuff, don't look at it in isolation. Look at what it kind of opens up with all the other new stuff that's coming. I think, this is just such an exciting time, as I said at the start, for CSS, because we're getting some really big game-changing features that are exciting on their own, but what they unlock together, I think, is really, what we need to be looking at. And really just changing the way we're thinking about developing with CSS, because it's becoming a much more sort of intelligent and elegant language. And a lot of this new stuff is designed for the real world of developing with frameworks, with component libraries. We're not just sort of sitting down with one person writing a style sheet from top to bottom anymore. We're working with big teams and complex stuff. And a lot of this new stuff that's coming through really has that understanding at heart. And it's been designed for that reality. So, I hope it's going to make the stuff that you're doing a lot easier, as well as allowing people to have some fun and do some cool stuff. And do show me experiments. I love to see the stuff that people are building. And really, just as I wrap up, do try out the stuff that's behind flags. I say this all the time, but you have a real chance to feedback where things don't do what they should if you play with experimental features. There are very, very few people who actually come and give us feedback on experimental stuff. We put this stuff out there behind flags. You know, it's often there for quite a while. It's there while the spec is being developed. You know, these changes that I was talking about in container queries that are like blowing up everyone's demos are because as the spec is written, the browser implementation is being updated. You know, and so if you spot something and you're like, hang on, this doesn't solve this really important use case that I see all the time, while the thing's behind a flag, that's the point at which you may well be able to make a change. And we see this all the time, that people point things out from the development community that spec writers and browser engineers, because they're not web developers. You know, people who write specifications and who, you know, are browser engineers working on the browsers, they're not web developers. Some of them have never been web developers. You know, there's a good few of us have been, you know, web developers at some point. But I tell you, you very, very quickly forget what it's like to be a web developer when what you do is talk about interesting CSS and you're not actually building websites. You know, I have to talk to web developers to make sure I know what it is that actually the reality is today. And so do talk to us. And if you spot stuff and you think, hang on, that could be so much better if, you know, let us know. You know, people are very interested. You know, the people on the CSS Working Group are often asking for feedback on Twitter and so on. You can always ask me and I will point you in the right direction of the person who you should be talking to. We do care, and you know, everyone who works on this stuff just wants to make the web better for everyone. And you know, I hope you enjoy using this stuff and playing around with the demos and bringing it into your work. So I hope you've enjoyed today. It's lovely to be back in front of you all, and thank you for having me.